Welcome back. Thanks for staying with us tonight on The Review. I have with me Mr. Noorani, Mr. Raza Ali Abdi and Raza Rumi in our Lahore studios. Thank you for staying with us this evening, gentlemen. Now, Mr. Noorani, you have an interesting observation about the book we're discussing this evening, The Coffee House of Lahore.
You see, the only note that is discordant, which I'd like to strike, is that K.K. Aziz is basically a historian. And he writes like a historian. But he's not basically a writer. Because a writer would try and bring out the idiosyncrasies of the people he's talking about, whom he had seen, and also some points which can be touched, which can be very tender. For instance, if I were to write about Faiz Saab, the little that I saw of him was his puffing cigarettes, smoking cigarettes endlessly, and his habit of not criticizing anybody. If he didn't like anybody saying anything, he would just remain quiet, and one can feel that he's not happy.
But wouldn't it be pertinent to say that K.K. Aziz was a very prolific historian?
Yes, and that shows, and that is the only weakness of this book.
But I would say that there is sufficient humor between the lines, especially regarding the entire coffee house culture.
Yes.
Let me bring in Raza Rumi on this. Raza, you've also read this book very closely, and I do agree to a point that there are biographies here of men that we know of, rather men who became well known for what they did later on in life, perhaps after they visited the coffee house. They were there in their young days, one could assume. But would you agree with Mr. Noorani's thesis on this?
Yes, I think Mr. Noorani has a fair point. Mr. Aziz was a historian, and he was not a writer of a different category. So he writes in his particular style. But I think we have to understand the purpose of this book, and K.K. Aziz mentions in the preface to the book that the reasons that he's documenting this is that when he came back to Pakistan after 30 years, actually to Lahore, he realized that the coffee house had been shut. So he asked many people, when did it shut? And nobody actually knew. And so he was so disturbed about this whole development that he made it a point that before he dies, he'll make it a part of his autobiography. And this book was actually a chapter of his autobiography, which turned so long that it became a book by itself. So he writes, I mean, it's there in the book as well. So the style is different, and the purpose of this book is different as well. And he says that, you know, the whole institutions that shaped the socio-political and cultural fabric of pre-partition India and later had to be documented because our society is indifferent. So he's trying to document what he remembers, and so that's why his book is of immense historical value and a reference, as was mentioned earlier as well.
Yes, Raza,
and
definitely.
Finally, I think
definitely a reference there. Definitely, I would say a reference there. Because there are biographies there which are very important to keep as a documentation. And he also writes this book in 2007. You mentioned earlier that he was a very disillusioned man nearer that time because he had fallen from grace.
Yes, he had. And finally, you know, one more point that he mentions is that he says that he wanted to also record his impressions of the coffee house and its participants, and and the whole milieu as it, you know, defined the age, or the, you know, he calls it the age of talent of the early 30s, 40s. And so I think it's a book of record.
Raza Rumi, thanks very much for all those interesting comments there on the book. And one last word from you, Mr. Abdi.
Well, I heard his lecture in London a long time ago, and he was a very bitter person. His only and big complaint was history is being distorted by the politicians and the governments. He was very bitter about that. Such a bitter historian writes such a pleasant book, which is surprising, and especially when he describes well-known people and tender points of their personalities. It's so catching and so
those were the people who made a huge impression on his life.
Yes,
he spent a lot of time with them, perhaps.
But again, he sounds to be very tender about his friends, very well-known people. Many of them are my friends, and I have been with these people for some time. Never knew so many facts about them, but now I do.
close observation there. Thank you very much for coming in, gentlemen, this evening to discuss the Coffee House of Lahore, memoir by K.K. Aziz, the second in his autobiography. Sadly, K.K. Aziz died in July this year. That's all from us tonight. I'm Razesh Setna. We'll be back next weekend at the same time. Do watch out for us.